the discussion of the rate increases that PERS has approved starting in 16. And then the final point of discussion will be the timing of the human services funding decisions.
Okay, great.
So with that, I want to just some quick comments about third quarter. A lot of this information you've been seeing in the connection with the budget, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly. We're going to really spend most of our time talking about the adjustments that are proposed to the budget this year. We have a long list of those, and that's going to take a little bit of time. Hopefully we'll go through them quickly. And then our expectation is that at City Council we won't go through all those adjustments, just kind of a more summary of the numbers.
Sure.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Jeannie Wilson, our Treasury Manager.
Ms. Wilson.
Good afternoon, Chair Francisco and Finance Committee members. I will be reviewing with you the revenue activity for the general fund for the 9 months ended March 31st, 2013. The first table you'll see here shows the year-to-date budget to actual performance for the general fund tax revenues through the third quarter. Overall tax revenues is $1.3 million above the year-to-date budget through March 31st. These revenues are trending to meet or exceed budget projections at year-end, and were discussed in greater detail at the budget presentation a couple weeks ago to your committee. I will point out that business license revenue is $240,000 above the year-to-date budget through the first 9 months. And this increase is due in part to an increase in license renewals, but also in part to internal and external audit of the business license program overall, and resulting in an 11% growth in this revenue line item. Okay, the second table breaks out other general fund non-tax revenues. Overall, these revenues are also trending to meet or exceed budget at year-end. The largest variance is in, or one of the largest variances in intergovernmental category. Intergovernmental revenues are approximately $349,000 above the year-to-date budget. This is due in part to the fire department staff projecting over $700,000 of mutual aid reimbursements for fiscal year 2013. This amounts to well over $300,000 above the adopted budget of $400,000 that they initially proposed. In addition, miscellaneous revenues are trending above the norm due primarily to a sale of city property well above over $500,000 in this line item. And finally, on the fee and service charges category, overall fees and service charges are about almost $19,000 over year-to-date budget and are very close to be expected to be very close to budget projections at year-end. This table provides more detail on fees and service charges by department, as you can see. Again, the budgets are very close to what's projected at year-end, just over at $19,000 at year-end. And with that, I'm available for any questions.
Questions from committee members? Ms. Murillo.
Thank you very much. What was that property that was sold? That was a pretty big bump.
Well, that was property that I've been made aware of was on Milpas, and I believe Bob might have a little bit more information
The
on
parking lot.
It was a property next to the post office near the roundabout. They sold it for about $500 and some change thousand, and it was unbudgeted.
Thank you.
Okay.
Say one question.
Please.
Thank you. So we have sort of a nice, if we look at the variances to prior year to date, most of it looks pretty good. And I'm wondering whether it's generally for positive reasons or just because the seasonality is that you're paying things in a little different fashion than we are paying things in a little different fashion than we expected.
because
mostly good news, or is it just a seasonality change?
I believe it's mostly good news because the analysis does trend the comparison to this time last year, or 75% of the year. So it does take into account a 3-year average. So it does appear that these revenues are trending more positive and will result in some additional revenues at the end of the year.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Chair Francisco and committee members. I'm Julie Nemes. I'm the accounting manager for the Finance Department. Today I'm going to be talking about general fund expenditures, enterprise funds, and proposed budget adjustments for the third quarter. I'm going to start with the general fund expenditures, and there's 3 columns I want to draw your attention to. First is year-to-date budget, and this is based on a 3-year average to adjust for seasonality. Second is year-to-date actual, which is actual expenditures through 3/31. And year-to-date variance without encumbrances is just a difference between the year-to-date actual and year-to-date budget. Overall, the general fund, most of the departments are, expenditures are coming in under budget or at budget. There are a few variances that are coming in over budget. I'm going to focus on the two most significant variances. The first is city attorney. At 331, city attorney is about $50,000 over budget. This is largely due to a one-time vacation cash out of about $27,000. In addition, there were some office supplies expenses related to the remodel project over at city attorney. Those are the major differences. However, they do have some additional revenues at 331 of about $96,000. So they're going to be closely monitoring their expenditures over fourth quarter to see if they want to ask for additional appropriations from those other revenues at the end of the year. The next department is fire. At 331, the fire department is about $460,000 over budget. This is almost entirely due to mutual aid, and I know that Jeannie touched on that. About $396,000 of that is related to mutual aid expenditures that exceeded budget. Almost all of that is offset by an increase in mutual aid revenues. There's also been the high fire season started May 1st, and there have actually already been mutual aid costs related to the fire that was in Camarillo. Right. So there's going to be costs with additional revenues, and the revenues exceed costs due to administrative fee on top of that. So the fire department is going to be closely monitoring those expenditures and revenues to book the total activity for fiscal year 13 at year end. Based on this mutual aid costs and revenues, they think they're going to come in at budget at year end, but they're going to be watching that pretty closely. And there is one adjustment they're requesting as well at third quarter.
Okay. Mr. White, you have a question?
On the mutual aid compensation, does that come through the state or does that come through the individual jurisdictions that ask for the mutual aid?
I don't know the question, but Ron Lichty is here who might be able to answer that question.
You need to be on a mic.
Hi, yes. The mutual aid revenues primarily come from either the National Forest, Los Padres National Forest, or from the state, from Calima, not from the local jurisdictions. We provide free mutual aid, for example, to Montecito or Carpinteria if they ask for it, unless it turns into a state obligation or a federal obligation.
So within our immediate environs, we collaborate with each other and take the hit, but as we go outside of our immediate neighborhood, then we start getting funding from bigger sources.
True, and we also receive that aid.
I understand. Yeah, I should, and we probably net over the decades get more than we give.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Those are the two main variances I wanted to talk about, but I did want to just briefly touch on library and community development. They both have a positive variance, and percentage-wise, it's not very significant as a percentage of their budget. I just wanted to note that those positive variances are largely due to vacancies, and that both departments do not feel that they're going to end the year that high with that much in savings. Library believes they'll come in around $150,000 under budget, and community promotion feels around $150,000, $160,000. Community development, sorry.
Mr. Chair,
Sure.
may I ask about police? It looks like a big encumbrance there. Did you mention that? And I didn't hear you.
And police is coming very close at budget right now. Even with the encumbrance, they feel like with some savings in fourth quarter, they do feel like they're going to come in close to budget, but that is another department we are closely watching, and they're closely watching their expenditures. But it is, as a percentage of their budget, even a little, it's a very small variance. You can see it's a negative 0.7%. But any small variance, because it's such a large budget can be a large amount. So not necessarily that they're going to use all that encumbrance for the year, but they are closely monitoring it.
If I could add, because this is important for I think the committee and the council to understand that with police, in the older days, before we got into more overhiring, and we had a lot more vacancies, we would be able to rely on the savings from salaries to cover their overtime costs, which are not adequately budgeted. But now that we're overhiring and we don't have as many vacancies, their budgets are really tight. And we're going to have to look at it probably in 15 to see, do we need to adjust our budget? Because it's structurally sort of off. There's not enough money for overtime. And we used to be able to rely on the savings from salaries, but we don't see that anymore. And that's why you see that they're right at budget. So they're going to be real close, and we are going to have to monitor that.
Okay.
And Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. White.
I didn't get, maybe you said it and I missed, what that encumbrance means and is.
For police,
Yes.
I don't know what makes up the individual encumbrances, but they don't, not always do they use all that encumbrance by year end. It might be things that they have planned for year end, but they don't actually end up spending all of it. But I don't know what comprises that entire encumbrance for police.
An answer?
We shall find out.
But I can definitely find out if you'd like me to find out what's in that 200.
I don't know what it means. It means it's just that that's the amount that we're out of.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I mean, encumbrance is a heavy word.
Sure. That is, generally that is additional costs they think that they might spend by the end of the year. And that's what's left for the end of the year. Those are encumbrances, POs, purchase orders that they've set up for costs for the end of the year. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they will spend it by the end of the year. So I guess with police, they're watching their expenditures and seeing that if they are coming in tight, they may not choose to spend all of those. Okay. I'm going to move on to enterprise funds. Enterprise funds are trending very similar to the general fund in that most of the enterprise funds are for revenues exceeding revenues and for expenditures coming in under target, under budget. There are two funds that I want to draw your attention to just due to the large variance, and then one has a negative variance. First, we'll look at the same three columns, but the first one I want to bring your attention to is the water fund. Both for revenues and expenditures, the revenues are coming in over target by about $2.4 million, and the expenditures are coming in under budget by $3.1 million. The revenues are exceeding due to the dry weather. They've just had more water sales. There was also a fairly large operating transfer into the fund of about $2.6 million that was budgeted, and the entire transfer took place in the third quarter, so that adjusted this number as well. On the expense side, there was the savings largely due to salary savings, but overall, Public Works tends to be very conservative. So they do project that they'll have about $3 million in savings for expenses at the end of the year.
Chair?
Yes.
Is that from reserves, that
Oh, the transfer?
Yeah.
It actually came from the capital fund.
from the capital fund? Thank you.
For the golf fund, revenues are coming in under budget by about $50,000. This is largely due to golf rounds and golf fees just being under budget. They're not tracking at target. Staff does project that they are going to come in at year end by about $32,000 under budget. There was a closure of a close golf course within the city recently, and they're hoping will increase some revenues in the fourth quarter. It closed in March, so they do think that'll offset some of this negative balance, but they do believe they're going to come in under budget by about $32,000. On the expense side, they're about $37,000 over budget right now. This is also due to a one-time vacation cash out, some higher water costs due to the dry season, and all of their equipment expenditures happening in the first 9 months of the year. But there are some savings that they project in the fourth quarter due to one vacancy in a higher position that they're not filling right now. And there's some other savings they're projecting, and they think that those savings should offset the reduction in revenues, but they're going to be closely watching that for the fourth quarter. Before I move on, do you have any other questions on enterprise funds?
Nope.
Okay, great. I'm going to move on to our budget adjustments because there's quite a few of them. So first, we have several for the general fund. So I'm going to start with the fire department. I briefly mentioned earlier that they had a request for a budget adjustment. This is for training costs they've already incurred, and they received reimbursement from the County of Santa Barbara. And so we're requesting both the recording of the estimated revenues and the appropriations for the training costs. For Public Works, right now there is a project at 101 State Street that they discovered contamination in the street surrounding utilities, which are scheduled to be replaced for the La Entrada project. So they have additional costs related to this, and they're requesting a transfer from reserves from the utility undergrounding fund into the general fund for this project. Community development. Currently, there are overnight accommodation mitigation funds that are in the affordable housing fund that are used that are for the general purpose of low-cost overnight visitor accommodation services. This relates back to 2006 in the California Hotel. And staff has determined the funds are better accounted for in the general fund and reserved in the general fund. So this is a request to transfer the balance that's in the affordable housing fund, which is the 1.2 million, and then the revenue and expenditure amounts of 58,000 and 28,000 that are in the affordable housing fund over to the general fund.
And you said it was going to be transferred to the reserves in the general fund?
Well, we will reserve for it in the general fund.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, Mr. White.
Does that stay isolated from the other reserves in some fashion? How do you account for that? So we'd have to
Sure.
kind of, it doesn't just end up in the pool of reserves in some way.
Sure, it'll actually have its own reserve just for this purpose. So it won't be combined with any other reserve. It'll have its own account. So within the general fund, its own reserve account. The next one is it's a non-departmental general government entry. And as of 4/30, the city had received about $3.5 million in one-time unbudgeted revenues. This is comprised of about $1.1 million in reimbursed property tax administration fees that were overcharged by the county. You probably have heard all of this before. And then there's about $2.4 million in the city's share of property tax increment funds, or about $277,000 was already approved by council to be used for the 911 call center. It leaves about $3.2 million that we're requesting to move from the general fund to the capital outlay fund, and staff will be going in summer and giving some suggestions to council on how to use those funds. And this is the capital entry side of that entry. Moving on to special revenue funds. This is the entry I spoke about on the general fund side. This is just on the affordable housing side. This is a transfer out of the affordable housing fund that went into the general fund for the accommodation mitigation funds. In the utility undergrounding fund, the first entry is the $70,000 I talked to briefly in the general fund, which was the transfer to the 101 State Street project. The other two entries are, there's about 11,500 available reserves and 26,000 in appropriated but unspent funds in a Cliff Drive project that staff would like to transfer to the Zone 6 pavement preparation project. They are planning to close this fund at the end of the year, so they're trying to move all available funds into projects, other projects. And so this is what's available left in the utility undergrounding fund is that 81,000, so this will close out that fund. And the Zone 6 pavement project is actually an annual project that they go and identify by city zone.
Yes, Mr. White.
Thank you. So the $70,000 that is going to remediating the toxics down on State Street.
Yes.
How does that fit into the UUT? That's a tax that's on our utilities, right? Or undergrounding fund.
No, the monies that are in the undergrounding fund were derived largely from the additional 1% that we're getting from Edison on the franchise fees. You know, we raised it from 1% to 2%. And for a while, we were putting some of that money into the utility undergrounding fund. We've since stopped doing that, but these are monies that are left over in that fund.
Okay, and then the utility undergrounding fund, what it was or is used for undergrounding utilities.
Exactly.
And so how does that fit into the 101 State Street
It doesn't.
remediation?
It's unrestricted
Doesn't.
money. It doesn't
It's
relate to it.
unrestricted money.
Yeah, so we're just taking whatever monies we have left over there, we're transferring out, and we have some projects that we can spend it on.
Okay, so then the undergrounding, that whole sort of program was taking unrestricted money and restricting it for, I mean, that's been going on for decades, hasn't it?
But, you know, it was one of those programs that, you know, we tried to do a lot of those things, but it required cooperation from property owners. And it just, we never
Unfortunately,
really
I got to watch
were successful.
several
Then
of
John
those things.
Owalczyk, who I think is sure can speak to that, but it's.
I don't want to raise those
So
ideas again. But.
we're just moving those remaining monies out.
Okay, I just didn't know whether it, I mean, that's news that it wasn't restricted and then we restricted it and now we're just unrestricting it again. Okay, thank you.
Sure.
In the streets fund, those first two lines relate to above when we were talking about the utility undergrounding fund, the transfer for the Zone 6 pavement preparation project. The next line the closed Cabrillo-Anacapa intersection improvement project. Staff actually identified this project as being completed, and those were available in unspent funds that they would like to now transfer to this new Highway Safety Improvement Program Traffic Signal Safety Project. That's a long title, to cover design costs and the city match. The funding, the grant funding will actually come in fiscal year 14.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't understand that. What's that last? New HSIP Traffic Signal Safety Project. Can you give or somebody tell, what is that project?
It's, okay, so it's actually, it's coming from the Highway Safety Improvement Program. and
That's
it's-
what Highway Safety Improvement Program. Okay.
And it's for design costs. So before the project begins, there's a lot of design costs related, and then the city's match. So that's what they're requesting, is for the funds to be transferred to cover those design costs and the city match before the grant funding comes in fiscal 14 for the project.
Okay. Thank you.
Moving on to the Streets Grant Capital Fund. Public Works applied for additional funding, grant funding for the Federal Highway Administration for current and 2 new projects. In fiscal year 13, they did receive notification of grant approval in the amount of about $2.3 million. So they're requesting that we book the estimated revenues and we allocate those revenues and appropriate for those 4 existing projects and then 2 new projects. So that's a list of the projects they'd like to increase appropriations for. I'm going to talk about Measure D and Measure A together. Both of these have available reserves that staff would like to use for the Zone 6 pavement preparation contract. In Measure D, there's $12,000 of unbudgeted but received interest revenue. There's an additional $112,000 of available reserves. So staff would like to use $124,000 to increase appropriations for Zone 6 pavement. In Measure A, there's $725,000 in available reserves that they would like to use to increase appropriations for the Zone 6 pavement preparation contracts. Next one is the Golf Course Capital Fund. Parks and Recreation identified the need for about $350,000 in maintenance equipment. This is for equipment that was aging or broken, and the repair costs were getting very high. So the Golf Fund had about $75,000 in available funds and appropriations, but they needed about $275,000 more. So they're requesting a loan from the Fleet Replacement Fund for $275,000. And the loan would have a term of 5 years with 3% interest to begin repayments in fiscal year 14. So this entry would be to actually transfer the money into the Golf Fund and appropriate to buy the equipment. I'm going to talk about the Water Capital Fund and the Wastewater Capital Fund together because the entries are related. This rehab aeration basin project originally was budgeted in both the Water Capital Fund and the Wastewater Capital Fund because it benefited both the water and wastewater utilities. But staff has determined that in order to better manage and track expenditures, it's easier to do it in one fund. So they're requesting to transfer the $742,000 of unspent appropriations in the Water Fund to the Wastewater Fund. But it's all for the same project. Again, here I'm going to talk about the Airport Capital Fund and the Airport Grants Fund together. The Federal Aviation Authority awards airport improvement grant funds based on bid after all of the design and permitting process. So all of the original design, bidding, permitting costs are paid out of the capital fund. And once the grant awards are received, staff requests reimbursement back to the capital fund. So in fiscal year 13, there was about $110,000 in design and bidding, permitting costs that they're requesting reimbursement to the capital fund. I'm going to again talk about these 2 funds together, which are Waterfront Harbor Preservation Capital Reserve Fund and the Waterfront Capital Fund. Waterfront has identified 3 projects that have additional costs, either due to an increase in scope or unanticipated needs. They're requesting a transfer from the Water Harbor Preservation Capital Reserve Fund from available reserves to the capital fund for these 3 projects. Do you want me to get into any of the details on this, or?
I think we'll be all right.
Okay, great. And then the last one is in our internal service fund. I already briefly talked about the transfer to the Gulf Capital Fund. That's for the loan to purchase the maintenance equipment. The second one relates to a parking enforcement officer scooter. This is actually already in the fiscal year 14 budget, but due to the current scooter having technical problems and a lot of repair costs, they'd like to actually purchase it now. And if it gets approved, staff will adjust the fiscal 14 budget before it goes to adoption.
Yes. Dwight.
I don't have a question about the scooter, but I do. There's something is sticking in my mind about the Zone 6 paving. There's sort of, it looks to me like you're proposing to sweep up some leftovers from somewhere and augment our customary. I'm seeing Mr. Wozniak nod his head. Augmenting our normal rhythm of investment and adding to that above what the normal apportionment is. And my question is this enough to have at least that zone this year not sort of stay even in its quality? As we've talked about, there's this sad trajectory of the streets getting worse year in, year out. Is this one of staff's creative ways to try and bump up the paving program a little bit?
Mr. Chair and Councilmember White. Actually, this is a strategy that we try to use annually, and when we put the pavement maintenance program together, we look at trying to forecast available revenues and also take advantage. And oftentimes when we get unit prices, if we can increase the amount of work that we're able to do, we'll look for opportunities for that as well. So I would say our strategy continues to be maximizing the effectiveness of our pavement maintenance contract work. And one of the ways that we attempt to do this is looking for the small quantities of funds remaining in another project, or in this case, we're also trying to, I think, clean up the accounting for Measure D money, which, as you know, we no longer receive, and we'd like to be able to complete the utilization of those funds. Then we no longer have to keep reporting about them. They're small, so it's using those opportunities to also be good housekeepers, yes.
Well, I really appreciate that effort, and obviously every bit that we can get towards sustainability in our street system is good.
That's it for all of our adjustments, our proposed adjustments, and I can answer any other
Okay.
questions you have.
Any further questions?
All right,
Thank you very
thanks.
much.
Okay, we're going to move on to the enterprise fund fees. We are going to include fire since they weren't able to make their presentation last week, so we're going to start with them first. Yeah. Okay, sure. If you could action to recommend those.
So move.
Sorry. Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. I'm Ron Lichty, the Administrative Service Manager for the Fire Department. Today I'd like to discuss the adjustments for the Fire Department's fees for fiscal year 2014 and 2015. The Fire Department recommends revenues of $3,246,964 in our fiscal year 2014 budget. Of this amount, $207,955 and $207,353 for 2014-2015. That's our amounts for our fees and service charges. And this represents about 6% of our annual budgeted revenues. This slide presents a more granular view of our fees and service charges. Fees were not increased in fiscal year 13. The last time they were increased was 2 years ago with the adoption of the two-year budget cycle beginning in fiscal year 12. Per the direction of the City Administrator's Office and under the guidance of our Finance Department, fees and service charges for the Fire Department section of the fee resolution were increased across the board about 4%, which corresponds to the 2-year Consumer Price Index quotient. And this percentage roughly equals the cost increases we've experienced the last 2 years as well.
Question. What are T19 inspections?
Those are inspections for facilities such as long-term care for the aged.
Okay, thank you.
That means Title 19. It's a title of the state fire code. The fee resolution that's been included as part of your budget package itemizes the changes per fee, per permit, and service charge. As an example of how this fee affects the public, typical engine company's fire inspection fee for a quarter-hour commercial occupancy up to 2,500 square feet will now cost $24, up $1 from $23. Another one of our most common fire inspection fees is for hotels or apartments that have 10 to 49 units. In this case, the fee increases from $146 to $152. And we conduct about 3,000 of these inspections a year overall. There haven't been any new fees or service charges proposed, new ones to the resolution. But however, there has been an entire section devoted to hazardous materials business plan inspections that's been eliminated from our fees. The work related to this section has been overtaken by the County of Santa Barbara, and the city is no longer responsible for performing these inspections for these affected businesses. So that concludes my presentation. So any questions about our fee increases, I'm welcome to take them.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon. Good morning, members of Finance Committee. I'm Rebecca Bjork, Water Resources Manager, and I'm here to talk about the Water and Wastewater Fund fee recommendations for fiscal year 14. As you will recall, on February 26th, Finance Committee made a number of recommendations with regard to rates and buy-in fees for the water and wastewater rates, so I will not be covering those again today. We are proposing for other fees, and we have a number of other fees that are detailed in the fee resolution. For those fees, we're generally suggesting a 3% across the board increase to keep up with costs of inflation. However, there will be no increase to the late payment fee. There's an $8 late payment fee that will not change. We are suggesting a couple of administrative changes to the fee resolution to remove reference to 1 and 1.5 inch fire lines, because we don't actually allow those. So it eliminates confusion by people thinking they might be available when they're referenced in the fee resolution. And then in fiscal year 10, we made substantial changes to the buy-in fees for water and wastewater and allowed people who had met certain milestones in their development to still come in at the fiscal year 9 costs. That's really outdated language. We're just deleting it. The Finance Department, who does the water billing, has requested an addition of a $20 administrative transfer fee. We currently have a $40-some fee for changing accounts between customers when we have to go out in the field and actually turn on and turn off and take meter reads. But we don't have anything to cover the cost, administrative cost only when it's just changing between parties and there's no need to read the meter. So this is to cover that, to allow a more appropriate fee to be charged to those customers. We're adding a buy-in fee for a 3/4 inch meter. Previously, we had a 5/8 inch meter and then a 1 inch meter. We can provide 3/4 inch meters. It allows people to provide, it's an increment between the 5/8 and the 1 inch, so it's a slightly less fee. And so there's really no reason not to offer that to our customers. We are proposing a new fee this year. We are calling it the reserved capacity fee. When a customer turns off their meter account, they currently are not billed any amount of money. And we've had some circumstances where those accounts have been offline for many years, and the customer comes back and reactivates the account. There's no sort of catching up with the amount that has cost for the capital maintenance of the infrastructure during the time the account has been inactive. And yet the utility has been being maintained in a way to keep it available for that account when it comes back online. So this is sort of like a catch-up for a buy-in fee. And we're proposing that it happen only after account has been inactive 6 months or more. And we have developed administrative procedures to allow this to be managed, but it's a way of keeping customers equal with existing customers so that existing active customers are not paying capital improvement for capacity that's being reserved for somebody who's not paying into the system. So that is a new proposed fee.
So what is the maintenance that's being covered here?
It would be things like maintenance of the collection or distribution systems, upgrades to the water and wastewater treatment plants. So when a new customer buys into the system, they're essentially reimbursing existing customers for having developed and maintained capacity to allow them to buy into the system. When we have a customer who is an existing customer but goes offline for a significant period of time, they're paying nothing towards the maintenance and operation of that system, and yet it's being maintained and operated on their behalf, just waiting for them to turn their system back on. This is to allow us to capture some part of those costs. And what we're proposing is just the meter charge, which covers the fixed costs of the facility. And so it's probably not really as much as would be attributed to the cost if they were paying the full amount, but it's a good way to keep some level of payment from those customers who are inactive into the system.
Mr. White, you had a question?
Just to kind of follow up on that. So what you're suggesting is to keep the meter charge going even when they make the meter inactive, and today the meter charge, I mean, I'm in simplistic terms anyway, whereas today when you say I'm going to stop using this meter, I can stop paying the meter charge but keep my meter. That's what's happening today.
That's correct.
And so you're saying when I stop my meter, and I will now be required to pay the meter charge even though it's stopped. Would be
effectively
in primitive terms.
Either pay it, or when it gets turned on again, pay the catch-up to get back to as if you had been paying it. And this is similar to the practice of other districts who generally don't allow accounts to be, they require it to be kept up with.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Water Commission has acted on all of the rates and fees and has recommended staff recommendations to the Finance Committee and Council. So that's it. If you have any questions.
Okay. Any further questions? Thank you very much. Do we need to take an action on this?
No, you're just hearing these
Okay.
reports.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Matt Four, Environmental Services Manager. We're here to talk about the proposed fee changes for FY14 for the trash and recycling rates. These are the rates that are charged to customers that subscribe to service that Marborgen collects. As you're aware, we have a whole new rate schedule for FY14 as a result of our negotiated contract with Marborg. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on types of customer classes this year, starting with the residential. So this slide here is all residential, including single-family residential and multi-unit. You'll see that with any new rate schedule, some rates go up, some go down. In the single-family residential sector, all rates went down slightly or they stayed flat compared to the current year. So for single-family homes, the big reason for that is that there is a lot more green waste and recycling that is inclusive with the trash rate. So whereas we used to charge a small additional fee for additional green waste, we no longer charge that because customers get a lot more green waste service with their trash. So those rates have gone down. On the multi-unit side, we have sort of a continuum of multi-unit customers. We've always had a minimum service rate for multi-unit. Both Marborg and the city felt that that was too high, and so we've adjusted that downward by about 12% in FY14. For those customers that have a lot of cart and can service, they're going to see about a 24, well, in this case, with this particular mix, they would see an increase. When we get to the next category, this multi-unit service, which is a dumpster customer, this is a small multi-unit customer with one dumpster going once a week. You'll see that their rates have essentially remained flat. And the reason for that is that we took away the additional dumpster rental fee that the customer used to pay. So a customer used to pay the container fee plus a rental fee through the garbage company, and we've since taken away that rental fee, so everyone sees a benefit there. On the large customers, the largest multi-unit customers are going to see an increase, and that was council's decision or feeling that those large multi-unit customers should be treated more like larger businesses. And these are the properties where we're looking at dozens and dozens of units. These are the big guys. So that's how we look on the residential side. If you have any questions, I can take those. Otherwise, I can go to the business customers.
Mr. White?
I think it's worth drilling down on those big jumps a little bit and describe, what was happening before and what's happening today.
Sure.
Because obviously there are two of them there that are really big numbers, and the rest of them are kind of, can get lost in the noise, but those
Right.
are big ones.
So I'll take for the multi-unit residential customer, this is the multi-unit property that has a lot of service exclusively in carts and cans. And what we were trying to show here is that, as you're aware, we set the diversion incentive or the rate break that a customer gets by subscribing to recycling or green waste or food scraps at 50% of the equivalent price of trash. So if somebody had a $100 trash container, it's a $50 recycling container, essentially. So that's how we're doing it moving forward. All diversion cans, what we call diversion cans, in both the multi-unit and the business sector are now a uniform rate. So there's no more confusion there. What's happening with
And if I may, then, but before, there were different rates for the different kinds, and they were much less?
Yes.
Okay. Maybe describe that a little bit.
I will.
Okay.
So for this particular cart can customer, the diversion incentive was about 75%. So they were only paying about a quarter of the equivalent trash rate. Now they'll be paying 50%. And one of the things that we were trying to achieve there with council was diversion rate stability over the next 10 years. So to foster stability, and kind of get off the volatility that you described. We felt, and Marburg felt, that 50% would get us there. So that describes that heavy cart can customer. For the bottom customer, they're the really big multi-unit customer. We negotiated a good deal with Marburg, but it's just a more expensive contract than what we have. We're replacing their existing diesel fleet with all compressed natural gas trucks. We have 1,200 public containers that they pick up. We have a big load of material that they collect from the annex yard, the corp yard, and our street spoils. So it is a little bit more expensive. Those bigger customers are taking some of that additional cost.
And why would they take it as opposed to it being spread out amongst the customer base? Why would you recommend that anyway?
Partly was working with kind of looking at where we have previously allocated costs, and so the multi-unit side, part of it is just with the multi-unit customers, we have never equalized and stabilized things, and now that we are, by virtue of raising the recycling incentives and keeping service packages the same, that's one of the natural outcomes, is they're going to generate more revenue. So, part of it is based on council direction, part of it is just overall rate tolerance, I suppose.
Thank you.
As we look at business customers, I only have 3 types of customers here. The first one is similar to the multi-unit side in that those customers that are paying the smallest, for the smallest level of service, their rates are going up by 30%. In real dollars, it's about $7 a month. But again, we were trying to make some adjustments in that the smallest business customers, we felt were getting a much better deal than than the other customers in the business sector, similar to how we lowered the rates in the multi-unit side for the smallest customers. For the business customer that has a lot of service in carts and cans, you'll see that their rates are actually going down a little bit. And then the big business customers that have a lot of trash, lots of trash, high volume, high frequency, they're going to pay more. This is one of the things that, one of the general rules is that as a customer has larger service and greater frequency, they tend to pay more. It costs more to service somebody where you're going out 4, 5, 6, even 7 times a week than somebody that has trash service once or twice a week. And we have quite a few of those customers in the downtown business sector where everybody's packed in and we have to have a lot of service. So that's our customer profile of what it's going to look like in 2014. Wanted to spend a few minutes on how we've gotten the word out, because this, again, this is a new rate schedule. Some rates are going up, some are going down. There are different sectors, and so we spent a lot of time, both the city staff and Marburg, since February when council approved the contract, getting the word out and explaining to people what the rates would practically mean to them in FY14. So I just wanted to throw this up as a list of folks that we have given presentations to or met with individually. Given presentations to all the chambers, the Restaurant Lodging Association, we actually tabled one of their events as well. Met with school district management and the parent advisory committee. We sat down with 6 of the largest multi-unit property management companies in the city and Goleta that own property in the city, including the Housing Authority. We published 3 different newsletters in various trade articles, and then I brought this for you. One packet for everybody. These are 2 brochures that we developed, and we have sent or will be sending this month one of these to every customer, all 24,000 customers in the city. The orange one on top, that's a residential brochure. That goes to single-family residences as well as multi-unit tenants. That's how to use the services, and we have a lot of new services for them. The teal brochure is for business owners as well as landlords. So it's more of a financial, how do I save money by recycling more sort of message. And so you'll either see those coming to your own home or or you already have, in the case of the residential. So with that, I can take any other questions.
Okay. Yes, Ms. Maria.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Four. So what you presented today is really what we combed through when you presented the negotiated contract, right? There isn't really anything new here. And I looked really painstakingly careful at the contract, but I've lived some life in between, so it's not all coming back to me. So this really isn't anything new. We're not seeing rate increases already.
You're correct in that this rate structure is exactly the same as what staff brought to you in November and twice in February. The only change, and this is what I had talked about yesterday during the budget presentation, the only change is the addition of the tipping fee increase and the CPI adjustment that we're contractually obligated to make. So the rates that you saw today were raised by 2.68% over what we brought you several months ago.
And you didn't mention it today, but I think one of the other reasons why rates are expanding a little is because Marburg had to be made whole because there's going to be more recycling, and so they're missing out on some of the profit on that. Isn't that right? There was it 600,000 or 800,000?
Well, when we negotiated the contract with Marburg, excuse me, we did negotiate a good deal within that profit margin that we wanted to provide, the competitive profit margin that we wanted to provide to Marburg. That did account for the migration that we expected to occur from higher priced trash containers to lower priced recycling containers. Right. So we accounted for that. I don't remember the exact figure, but it's built into the rates on the front end, day 1 of the contract, so that in year 10, we have kept them whole throughout.
And another reason for some of the increase is that in maybe a couple of years ago, some of these commercial customers were given a reduction as an incentive, and was that food scraps or, sorry, like I say, I'm not remembering exactly the details, but we had to sort of
Sure.
make up for the reduction that they had earlier.
So in the past, as we alluded to previously, the diversion incentives, the financial incentives for those recycling containers were different. So in the business sector this year, the financial incentives range from about 70 to 83%. So there's a 15 to 30% trash equivalency rate that one might pay, or getting a price break of 70 to 85%. In FY14, with setting all of those diversion containers at 50% across the board, we're effectively shrinking the financial incentives that one might receive, but we still felt that 50% was still a good deal. That's still quite an incentive for somebody to take advantage of. In the multi-unit sector, the dumpsters were always set at 50%. It was the carts and cans that were getting the 75% price break, and that's now being reduced to 50%.
And then finally on this subject, I think we've talked about in council meetings a comparison of what City of Santa Barbara residents pay for their trash collection and other services as compared to Goleta, unincorporated county, and Carpinteria. And we talked before the meeting, Mr. Four, and you said that you had emailed it to us, but I don't think it's ever been presented in an open session. And whenever we raise water rates, there's some graph there for the public to know that CARP water charges this, City of Santa Barbara charges this. So thank you for this. Oh, here's a comparison.
So here's your table.
Okay.
Hard to fit onto one slide, but I did want to bring this to you.
I would ask that whenever we're discussing the hauling contract again, or whenever is a convenient time, maybe we can show that to the public, how much we're paying as opposed to Goleta, trash producing public.
Yeah,
Thank you.
That's a good point. So how about, let me run through a couple things here, but during the Proposition 218 hearing, and when we bring this back in June, I'll be sure and break this up into a couple of slides that we can do that. Just not to spend too much time on it, but in general, what you'll see is that in the residential sector, we're right within the market area. One of the critical differences between the city and the other jurisdictions listed here, all of the other jurisdictions have some level of full automation in their trucks. We have two drivers or two persons on the vehicle, one driver, one person who goes and retrieves carts. The other cities do not. There's one driver with an automated arm that's grabbing those containers. So that reduces their personnel costs. So given that, I think our rates are pretty good. In the multi-unit side, our minimums are definitely better. One of the ones I draw your attention to is that small apartment and condo. You'll see that we are not in line with the other jurisdictions. Our rate structure in FY14 did not create that discrepancy. It merely continues it. And that's one of the big differences with the City of Santa Barbara is we have 2,623 multi-unit customers. That is, we have the bulk, lion's share of all multi-unit properties on the South Coast in the City of Santa Barbara. We've always had a different rate structure for multi-unit because we're the only jurisdiction who has it. Goleta and the county, like Isla Vista, have big apartment buildings, but they don't have the small duplexes and triplexes and mid-range properties that we have. So that's one of the reasons, it's a structural reason why we're so much different than the other jurisdictions. In the business sector, you'll see that we're on the high side of the market area. Some of our rates are better, some are about the same, and some we are more expensive than the other jurisdictions. The only other caveat I'd give to this is that these are the current FY13 rates. So these are the rates that the city negotiated in the proposed. I did not raise these by our CPI because I could not get the CPI adjustment numbers from all these other jurisdictions. But I did look at their contracts, and we're essentially identical. So I would expect the other jurisdictions to be raising their rates by about 2.68% as well. So the basis is the same. So if you have any questions, I can take them, and I will definitely bring these in June.
Thank you.
Any further questions? Thank you, Mr. Four.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and committee members. My name is Brian Bossy, and I'm with the Waterfront Department. And before you today, and yesterday actually, are our recommended fee adjustments for fiscal year 2014 and 2015. We are proposing in both 2014 and 2015, the first on our list is our slip transfer fee increases. Fiscal year 2014, a $25 per foot increase, which will now total $350 per foot on our slip transfers. And again, in fiscal year 2015, a $25 per foot, bringing the total to $375 per foot for 2015. I should let you know that this does not include our 20-foot slips, which are locked in at $200 per foot. Our slip fee increase, we are proposing a 2% increase, and I have a slide on this in a minute to show you what that does. This is a requirement, or it's a part of our loan covenant with our Department of Boating and Waterways loan. That loan is what has helped us to do the Marina One construction project, which continues. And lastly on our list, well, as far as the slip fee is concerned, I should let you know that every year we do a survey of 18 marinas up and down the coast of California to see where we fit in as far as our fee structure. And across the board, we are generally lower than all of the other publicly owned marinas, especially when it comes to marinas below Point Conception. So we're doing well in that particular fee area. As far as our self-pay parking lots, we are proposing that we adjust those fees to $2 per hour. They would be consistent with our other staffed lots. And these are the lots currently now, they are $3 for every 3 hours with a $7 maximum per day. So we'd like to adjust those to be consistent across the board with our fees. The only outlier would be Stearns Wharf, which, as I mentioned yesterday, is a different animal as far as parking fees are concerned. As far as going back to the slip fees, here's a representative example of different lengths of slips and the current fiscal year 13 costs, as well as what our proposed fee increase would do to those. So as you can see, it goes from anywhere from a 20-foot slip being increased by $3.20 to $162. Down to a 60-foot slip, which is one of our larger slips. That would change a total of $13.20 from what it is in the current fiscal year. This next slide shows the three fees that we're proposing and their history. As you can see, the slip transfer fee has gone up $25 per foot over since fiscal year 2009. Currently, we're at $325, and again, we're proposing that it go to $350 and then $375 in the consecutive fiscal years. Our slip fees, 2%, 4%, 4%, 3%, and then again, we're continuing on with that 2% push. And our parking fees, we have had no increase or changes since fiscal year 2010, which I believe most of those fees went up about 50 cents per lot. And so these changes in fees are what we're proposing for this fiscal year. And this is just an overall look at our total operating revenue versus our total operating expense on the bottom. So you can see we're continuing to stay above the line as far as revenue and expenses are concerned. And what we do each year is we go through and we map out 6 years into the future as far as capital projects are concerned, and just to make sure that we're above the board with everything. So that concludes my presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bossy.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I get to say good afternoon because we're now there. Yancy Rapp, Parks and Recreation Director, and here to present the proposed golf fee changes for our municipal golf course. Historically, the golf course has raised fees $1 a year. We're going back to that model. So increasing our fees $1 a year to cover our increased operational costs. We are also proposing a $1 increase to create a Players Course Improvement Fund. This fee and this fund came recommended to staff from the Golf Advisory Committee. Over the years, the golf course has focused our capital investments on a couple of greens, and then looking out, we have some major capital improvements that are not necessarily focused on improving the play for golfers, but things that we have to do to maintain the course to be good stewards. So the Golf Advisory Committee, in talking with golfers and home clubs, have floated the idea of a special fund that would generate money each year that would be spent on priorities of the golfers to improve their play. And so they proposed the $1 fee and this fund. Those funds would be segregated in the golf fund budget, and as those funds are generated through the additional fee, then the Golf Course Advisory Committee will solicit input from the golfers and then prioritize how those funds would be spent in that year. So the kinds of improvements that they're talking about are tee boxes, bunkers, sand traps, and greens. So things that really make a difference to the golfers, and the golfers having a voice in what those priorities would be. So with those two things, that would raise the golf fees by $2. The Golf Advisory Committee, in reviewing the fees, realized that the version that went forward with the published budget needed a correction. They had also wanted junior rates to only go up by $1. So, and then they also wanted to discount further the Super Twilight rate for juniors. So instead of paying $17, they will pay $7. And this is part of the focus on increasing exposure to the sport of golf. We've had a significant increase in golf programs geared to juniors, and we're seeing a lot of success and increase in rounds. And so they want to build, the Golf Advisory Committee wanted to build on that. So those are the proposed changes for the golf course this year. Any questions? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So that concludes our discussion of the fees for both general fund and enterprise funds. And if Michael, oh, I'm sorry, downtown parking. I'm so sorry. Did you have a PowerPoint? No. Sorry. No problem.
Just zoom in on the bottom. Bottom. It's number 16. There you go. So in the downtown parking program, there's just a couple of minor adjustments we're recommending in the areas of fees. One, in the area of what we charge when a construction company wants to come in and put a roll-off container in one of our parking lots to take up parking. We currently charge them $20 a day, $400 a maximum. We're recommending eliminating the maximum they're basically getting a $200 a month break when we at the $400 maximum. And they do impact the parking. You know, our recent experience, especially with Lot 5, with that impact in the construction, we start getting complaints when parking spaces aren't available. So why give a contractor a break when they have a roll-off? And hopefully we'll get them to get it out of the lot a little quicker than they are. So that's one that we're recommending. On the other two that we're recommending is the area of the depot lot, Lot 5. We currently are charging passengers on Amtrak and started with the Greyhound passengers as well, $2 a day to park if they present their ticket, you know, for the train or the Greyhound. We're recommending raising that up to $5 a day. Still a substantial break. Our normal daily rate is $20 a day, so still giving a pretty good discount. And the other one we're recommending is in the area of bike parking. For rental, we have bike lockers. If we decide to do something differently, after we get input from the TCC and the parking committee and the bike station, charging a maximum of $35 per quarter instead of the $25 currently for the bike lockers. We have lockers over at Lot 3 right now. Hopefully they'll get better users in there and not people who use them to store stuff rather than park the bicycles. So those are the recommendations we're making in terms of fee changes for the next fiscal year.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think that does then conclude the fee discussion.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to talk about the funding policy changes by PERS. So some background, and for most of you, you know this, but in 2008 and 2009, as a result of the a tremendous economic downturn, PERS assets dropped from $260 billion, that is with a B, down to about $160 billion in just over about a year and a half. And so that's a $100 billion loss that they sustained. And as you can imagine, before even rates kind of took into effect in the future, or any impacts of the rates, that instantly created unfunded liabilities for all agencies across the state who participate in CalPERS. And you may also recall that because of that, they implemented a 3-year strategy to raise rates beginning in 2011 through 13, this current year, to try to make put a dent on or try to recover some of that $100 billion loss. So we saw more than usual increases to our rates starting in 11. More recently, I think primarily the actuaries or the PERS staff came to the conclusion that there's no way that they're going to be able to make up that $100 billion loss just by doing better than what they assume, and particularly in investment returns. You know, they assume 7.5%, and even with the 3-year phase-in of rate increases, they realized that something equally dramatic was necessary in order to undo that big loss in 2008 and 9. And they've also been under a lot of pressure regarding their assumptions. There's a lot of discussion about whether 7.5% is a realistic assumption. And so they've been overall just decided they're going to look comprehensively at their assumptions, their policies essentially that drive the calculations of unfunded liabilities and are their rates. And then in addition to that, sort of separate from it, but GASB, which is the Governmental Accounting Standards Boards, they set accounting requirements and reporting requirements for all state and local governments. And they've issued some new pension disclosure requirements that are going to be coming due in a year or two. And what they decided was that they felt that there isn't enough adequate disclosure within the footnotes related to pensions to adequately describe what is the true level of unfunded liabilities, because they also believe that some of the smoothing techniques that PERS has been using is not realistic, and some of the assumptions they're using are not realistic. So they were going to force PERS, who provides us those disclosure information, with a whole different set of actuarial information that was more, from their perspective, realistically presenting the true unfunded liabilities. So that was another kind of pressure that PERS was sort of feeling about. Do we want to present two different things, and why is there such a big difference between our assumptions and what we'd be required to present in our CAPRs?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Mr. Samario, can you explain for me and the public, you referenced right now 7%.
7.5%.
7.25. What does that mean?
Yeah, the 7.5% is one of the key assumptions that PERS uses, and it's what they assume that they will earn in all their investments on average, not in any given year, but on average over a funding period that goes from 20 to 30 years. So they look at really long-term windows about what they would earn, and so that's what that is.
So that's the assumption that people are challenging.
That's one of them, yes.
Okay.
So not too long ago, just last month in April, the CalPERS board, after a considerable discussion, they did adopt changes to certain funding policies or assumptions in 3 areas. The first, and I'm going to go into these in more detail, but just to summarize, the amortization period for the unfunded liabilities. It has to do with over what period of time do we try to address these unfunded liabilities created in large part by the economic downturn in 2008 and 9. And then also the policies related to how they smooth their investment gains and losses. And then lastly, and I'm going to say it, but I'll have to explain it later, is what they call the use of an asset valuation corridor. Their implementation plan is that these new policies will be in effect for when they do the valuation for the year ended June 30, 2013. They do it every year, and it affects rates 2 years out. So it will affect, actually 3 years out. It'll affect the employer contribution rate starting in fiscal year 2016, and they will run for a period of 5 years. And then these new changes will run out in 2020, and then it'll go back to a normal sort of routine of rate increases, rate adjustments. They have already provided us with 2014 rates, the actual rates that we are going to have in place. They're built into our adopted or recommended budget. They've also provided us with a 2015 rate estimate, and they, at this point, are saying that rather than give you updated information in next year, you can, for the most part, just rely on those estimates we've given you for 15 in terms of setting your rates and your costs. So the implementation of these new rates starting in 16 will be building upon the rates that they've provided for us as estimates in fiscal year 15. So these are the implications of the policy changes. These are some of the things that PERS has indicated, and these are just some of my comments. As I said, it's going to result in significant rate increases starting in fiscal year 2016, and we'll see those. It's also ironically going to result in increased rate volatility. Back in 2002 or 3, when just after the recession of the 2001 and 2, one of the things that PERS did was they implemented dramatically different smoothing policies to try to avoid volatility. So they did these techniques and policies, and they're really deciding we're going to unwind that. We don't think it's a good idea to be spreading things over a longer period of time because of the loss that we've had, we're never going to get there, or they feel they're never going to get there. So we're going to see more volatility in the rates, but they indicate, or they say that what we're going to see are more or less dramatic increases when we have events like we just had a few years ago. So when we see large investment losses, we're not going to see as dramatic of an increase. That's what they have indicated. And it will improve funding levels for sure. Obviously, when we're paying more into it, it's going to start getting us higher in terms of our funding status. And theoretically, that's my editorial comment, theoretically put us agencies on a path to be fully funded in 30 years. That's their goal. They believe that these changes are going to get every agency to be at 100% fully funded in 30 years, long time from now. But they do believe that although the short-term rates are going to be impacted, that longer term we're going to see rates actually going down and being lower than they otherwise would be under current policies. And as I sort of alluded to before, that one of the implications is that these new policies will align with the upcoming accounting standards and disclosure requirements by GASB, so there won't be this differences now. The required disclosures will be exactly the same with new policies. So the things that were not affected with these changes, and this is important, and because that's the question that Ms. Murillo just mentioned, this has nothing to do with any changes to the assumed rate of return of 7.5%, and that's really where most of the media has been pointing to as to whether that's a realistic number. At this point, they're not proposing to change it, and they have not also made any changes to assumptions related to salary increases. They make assumptions of about 3 to 4% per year that the salaries are going to grow, and those are going to stay the same. And they haven't adjusted their mortality rate assumptions. They have mortality tables that they follow, and periodically they change those. And as you know, people are living longer, But these changes do not reflect any changes to those assumptions, and they have not made any changes to their assumption for CPI, the index that they use for in the cost going up every year. So some details. So the amortization period is the first. And what is it? It's, again, it's the period of time when you essentially try to pay off your debt. The PERS, and we all have a debt. It's called the unfunded liability. And the amortization period is the period of time when they try to address that unfunded liability. Under the current policy, and I think, again, think of a mortgage. Their current policy is that they have what's called a 30-year rolling amortization period. So essentially, every year they refinance that unfunded liability over a new 30-year period. It's not a closed period. They just keep refinancing every year, just like if you were to do that on your mortgage. Every year, another 30-year term, another 30-year term. And what that really means implicitly is that they are essentially and have been relying primarily or heavily on investment returns above their assumptions to close that gap. So before the impacts of a couple of years ago, a few years ago, they were able to say, well, let's rely on those investment returns above 7.5%, 7.75% back then, to try to address any unfunded liabilities. And so, but they essentially spread that number over a long period of time. Their new policy is we're no longer going to be rolling this out. We're going to just establish a fixed 30-year amortization period. So their goal is whatever those unfunded liabilities are, we are going to make whatever changes to our rates every single year so that by year 30, that unfunded liability, one way or another, is going to go away. So it's no longer this rolling 30-year period. It's a fixed 30-year amortization period for the unfunded liability. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? The smoothing policy.
It doesn't make sense. 7.5% doesn't make sense, but I understand their logic anyway.
Sure. And we'll look at that as well, by the way. So the smoothing policy, this is the period of time when, as you know, every year they have investment results that are different than what they assume. They assume 7.5%, and I've said this before, what they can tell you with 100% certainty is that they're not going to hit a 7.5%. They want something different. And every year they're going to be above it, or any given year above it, any given year below that. And those investment gains or losses, which they typically have from year to year, ignoring what happened years ago, they spread those gains and losses over a 15-year period. They spread them out so that we don't see rate volatility. That was the whole idea, rate smoothing. So again, the 15-year policy is what is in place today. The new policy is going to spread that over a 5-year period. So you're going to see more of those gains and losses being impacted on the rates more quickly rather than spreading them out over 15 years. And that could be to our benefit, too. If we have a year with great, good investment returns above their assumption, we're going to see a more immediate impact to our rates and essentially a downward impact. And the 5-year number is what GASB was requiring in their disclosures. They said, whatever you guys want to do with 15 years, whatever, we're going to require you to disclose it based on a 5-year amortization period for these annual gains and losses. The asset valuation quarter. So PERS has this term that they use. It's called the actuarial value of assets. And it's different than the market value of assets. Market value is really pretty objective. They know what it moves up and down for every year, but they allow the market value of the assets to swing within a quarter of 80 to 100%. And what that means is that if let's say that it fell to 85% in a given year, went from 100%, it dropped 15% to 85% of what it used to be. That would not have any direct impact on the rates that they are proposing or calculating. They allow it to sort of fluctuate, again, as a rate smoothing approach. Recently, when in 2008 and 9, we went below that quarter. A lot of agencies did. We got into the 70s, and that's why we had to see even more dramatic increases to our rates. And that's really that 3-year strategy. They said, a lot of agencies now are below the 80% that we allow, so we need to make some course correction. But it really essentially allowed the market values to be well below what they should be, and they didn't reflect it in the unfunded liability calculation, nor did it reflect in our rates. And so their new policy says we're going to eliminate that quarter and the whole concept of actuarial value of assets. So now they're always going to just present assets at their true market value, and they're going to adjust rates based on market value, and there's not going to be any quarter anymore. So it's going to be a more reactive to what it really should be, rather than sort of ignoring these variances and not doing anything about them.
Mr. Samario, could you go back? What's the reason for the change?
Again, the reason for that is because particularly when the market values drop, they can drop by 20%, and it's not going to have a direct or additional impact on rates. And they in the end concluded that while it was a good smoothing technique in the past, we can't have these smoothing techniques in place anymore because we've got to address a huge unfunded liability. And these smoothing techniques that they had in the past really work against them in trying to get there. So this is just one smoothing technique they had in the past. They say we got to do away with it. So we're again adjusting rates more on a real-time basis, and rather than sort of kicking it down the road a little bit.
Okay.
I apologize. This might be a little difficult to see. So this is sort of the presentation we typically would include in our annual comprehensive financial report, our CAFR. And they've always provided us the disclosure information, and you can see the first column of orange. It was based, they would calculate the unfunded liability using the actuarial value of assets. Again, it's an artificial number. And so it sort of distorted the numbers. In miscellaneous plan, for example, the unfunded liability shows here $92.2 billion underfunded, which shows us as a status of 77.5%. The safety plan, we were at 78% of that's correct, and then 79% for the fire plan. So that's using the actuarial value of assets. This is using the market value of assets. This is really what we have in the bank. I mean, it's not this made-up number for smoothing purposes. This is really the market value of what we had as of June 30, 2012. And you can see the funding status is less than what it is under the other approach. And this is really now going to become the new focus and the new basis for just making decisions about rates in the future. It's what is a true funded status using market value assets.
So the whites, then the next column, the unfunded liability / excess over excess assets, then we're looking at a total of around 226 or 2.25.
Right, $1 billion.
No, 226 million, right?
No, that's billion. Million. I'm sorry.
That's our. This
Million.
is our account, right?
I'm thinking more PERS. This is millions.
Right.
Yes.
Well, yeah. But so we're a quarter. We were at $250 million last year. Now we're at 225 this year, having had a good year.
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to get into really trying to project what it is that we might be seeing in terms of our actual costs, retirement costs in 2020. And what PERS cannot tell us for every agency what our costs are going to be or what our rates are going to be because every plan is different. And what they provided to us is a table. And it says that depending on what they call the volatility of your plan, and I'll talk about what that is, this is what you can expect your rates to do starting in 16 over a 5-year period. And again, I'll define it, but if you have an AVR or an asset volatility ratio of 4, you can expect to see, starting in 16, a 1.1% increase to rates every single year. So if your rates are, let's say, 10% in 15, then they're going to be 15.5 at the end of 20. If you have a ratio of all the way to the right of 15, which is a much more volatile plan, there you're going to see the most significant, potentially the most significant increases. Every year you're going to see 4.2% increase for a total of 21. So if your plan, your rates are currently 10, they're going to be 31%. The volatility ratio really relates to how big the plan is. We have 3 plans, as you know. We have a miscellaneous plan, and we have a safety for fire plan, and then a safety for police. The larger the plan is, the less volatile it is because you're dealing with bigger dollars. So the smaller it is, any impact to that is going to have a disproportionate impact because you're dealing with a smaller plan with smaller dollars to kind of respond to that. So it really has to do with the size of it. So our plans we have the 3 plans I mentioned. For the police sworn, we have a volatility ratio, which they give it to us every year, of 8.8. For a fire, it's higher, it's 10.1. And for a miscellaneous, because it is smaller, and it's the smallest, it's 5.6. So what I use is the table that you just saw a moment ago that PERS provided to calculate based on our rates today, and if we use that table and applied it, what will our rates be in 2020? So you'll see that the first row is current actual for 2014. Those are rates that we know of. They've told us, and those are in the bank. Those aren't going to change. For police sworn, it's 35.163. For fire sworn, 35.264. And for miscellaneous, 23.635%. And you can see above where I indicated what the increase per year will be based on their AVR. So police is going to go up every year 2.2% starting in 16, for fire 2.8, and for miscellaneous 1.7. I will say that on the far right miscellaneous, because there's this cost sharing agreement where they pick up about a third of any increases, the real impact to the city is going to be about 1.2% per year. So you'll see that the second row is what they provided us. I mentioned the estimate for 2015, and that's what the one number they say, we're probably going to leave that alone, even though it could be subject to adjustment. We're probably going to use that as the basis for 15 and build upon that starting in 16. So all I've done is I've based on their asset value volatility ratio. I just did the math. For police, I've added 2.2% every year starting in 16 all the way down to 2020, and you can see that by 2020, the rate would be 48% versus what it is today, 35%, and also what the effective increase is. These numbers do not reflect the employee portion of the rate that the city, at this point, we're assuming is going to be paying. And of course, that's all going to be subject to negotiations. But in 14, what we've assumed is that fire and police will pay 6% or 3% of the 9%, and the city would pay the 6%. So the real rate would be at the bottom for police, 48 plus 6%, or 54, and then for fire, 51.6 or 57.6%, assuming that what's the current arrangements today continue for the next 6 or so years. For the miscellaneous, they're already paying all of their rate this year, and actually next year you'll see their 23% number. For 14 is actually going to be reduced because they're going to now start to pay the employer share of the rate. They're paying 0.223% of the employer rate because their cost sharing agreement now exceeds the 8% number. So they're actually going to, again, start paying a part of the employer rate. But that's been adjusted. So you can see what the rates are going to be in 2020 and what the effective increase is in relation to 2014. So police, an effective increase of 36%, not the 50% that they've people have been talking about, with PERS, they're saying we're going to go up by 50%, so not quite there. Fire is the closest to the 50% number because they have the highest volatility ratio and the smallest plan. Any questions on this? Next, I'm going to show you the dollars.
Okay.
So I'll give you, we did this morning. We were trying to come up with these dollars. I'm giving you two numbers for the general fund only. The 2014 budgeted cost for retirement, $16.8 million. And based on what I just showed you, what we project them to be in 2020, and it'll be $22.4 million, so an effective increase of 33.7%. I didn't present, and I didn't think it was appropriate to show you sort of a multi-year forecast with all the revenues and expenditures going out to 20 because there are so many variables and assumptions. This is, to me, it's a little bit out of context, but it gives you sort of a sense of, on a percentage basis at least, what can we see our costs going up. It works out to be somewhere in the order of about 1% per year relative to our overall budget. So we can think of it in that term. If our revenues grow 3 to 4% or 3%, which they typically do, all combined, then this would consume about a third of that revenue growth every year. Some other considerations, as I mentioned, the reduction of the assumed return on investments of 7.5%. I'm going to go to this first because I think this is appropriate. This is a 20-year history of the return on investments at PERS, including, as you can see in the bottom right, what happened in 2008 and really 2009. So this is a 20-year history. As I said, their assumption is 7.5%. So they're never really, really close to that. They're all over the map, and they know that. It's just the nature of the investment. The stock market is what they primarily invest in. It's a very volatile investment portfolio. Over this 20-year period, however, they have averaged 8.2%. So one can argue they've actually done better than their assumed 7.5%. Back then, it was actually 7.75%. And as I think I explained to this group before, the council, that it's that average of 8.2% can be a little bit misleading. And what I mean by that is, look at the far right. I mentioned the 2009 number. They dropped 24%. It's really more than that because they assumed 7.5%. So they're really 31.5 or so below where they should have been, right? But in order to get back to even, they don't need a 31% increase the next year. They need more than that because of the way the compounding works. And what I mean by that is, if you have $100 and you lose 25%, you need 33% to get back to where you were before. But even more than that to get back to the 107 you expect it to be based on their assumptions. So these big drops have a significant impact on their ability to recover. It's almost like our sales tax revenues when they dropped by 16%. We will really never recover from that. We'll always have this permanent variance that had we not had that big loss. And we can have great returns in following years, but it's going to take huge, huge returns over a sustained period of time to recover. So whether or not the 7.5% is a good number, who knows? I mean, if you look at history, it's been pretty reasonable, but that's where a lot of people have been focusing a lot of attention. There have been articles recently in the news press about whether that's a good number to use.
Right.
I don't know. But PERS right now has not made any changes to that. But my guess is that they will be looking at that again, and potentially either because of political pressure or otherwise may look to lower that by 25 basis points.
Okay. Mr. White, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. And if you could return back, although the last slide it doesn't exactly address it, but one of the issues here that's hurting us is as I recall, isn't it in 1999, and it would be useful to have something in these conversations going forward, is how much outflow, just as you present us every year, every 3 months, how much money we got in and how much money went out. What happened with PERS? How much money went out? And as I understand it, somewhere in the 2000, 2001 range, outflow increased by a substantial amount because the pension rates went up substantially. And I think that would be helpful part of this exercise is one of educating not just us, but educating our community and hopefully more.
Yeah.
So how much money did they spend? And did they, obviously what we do as people is when we have one of those 29% hits is we cut back on how much we spend. And obviously what we have here is major increases in expenditures. And that would be useful to have, an interesting, useful piece of information to have.
Mr. Chair, Committee Member White, I'm not sure that kind of exercise is as meaningful to when we're talking about a trust, a pension trust. They have an obligation to pay benefits that have been promised to their employees, or at least the agency's employees. And their job is really to collect the right amount of money in order to make those promises. And one variable is how much they're earning and what they assume in terms of their investments. The other side is on what we call the liability side. Are those assumptions valid, and they have to adjust those? But this is what causes most of the volatility. But in the end, the money that goes out is exactly based on what's been promised, and what comes in is to cover those. And they're obviously in a little bit of a hole right now. And they got to make up for that.
It's a big hole. It's not a little hole. Yeah, and the outflow is still it's a real piece of the conversation. Even though I appreciate what you're saying that there's it is strongly clad, but nonetheless it's integral to our well-being and our whole system in California in particular. So I still think that would be a useful number to see just going over time because it's obviously affecting how much money they have to raise.
And then the last thing, other potential changes, as I mentioned earlier, people are living longer. Several years ago, they adjusted their mortality rates, and they found that people, again, not surprisingly, were living longer. Interestingly, back then, they found that public safety actually surpassed miscellaneous employees in terms of longevity of life. My understanding is, and this is still just kind of in the discussion phases, but my understanding is that PERS is going to be looking at both of these sort of variables, the rate of return assumption and mortality rates, and maybe making additional changes that would have additional impacts on rates, upward impacts to our rates. So when they've talked to think about the 50% potential increase, I think they were sort of considering the rates, the changes we just talked about, but potentially these changes as well. So the obvious, as I said, our revenue growth is typically in the 3 to 4% range, even though taxes may grow 4%, other revenues don't. So the impacts are really going to be, there are other impacts, I should say, that we haven't really factored into the equation, increases to health insurance costs, upwards pressure on salaries, particularly since we've gone so long with no salary increases. So that's obviously just pressure that's placed on the budget. And then the typical, every year additional demand for services. Those are the sort of things on top of the fact that we are going to be seeing these increases to our PERS rates and PERS costs. So that concludes my presentation, unless we happen to answer any questions.
Okay. Questions?
I would appreciate your emailing that we didn't get that in
apologize.
In paper. That's okay, but just I'd appreciate getting your emailing that to us, because that's a very interesting package of information. Okay. Thank you for that.
Has PERS said anything about when they will be considering changes to the discount rate?
Yeah, they're doing that now or this year, and if they do make those changes, they would become in effect in fiscal year 17.
Okay.
So this past year relates to 16. This current year will relate to 17.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so next we're going to talk about human services funding. Save the best for last.
The best for last.
So tell me
Thank you, Chair Francisco and Finance Committee members. My name is Sue Gray, and I'm the Community Development Business Manager in the Community Development Department. And today I'm here to talk to you about the timing of the Human Services funding allocation from Council. I wanted to start with just a little background information. As you know, the Council-appointed Community Development and Human Services Committee, they are responsible for recommending funding to Council for two different pots of money, the Federal Community Development Block Grant Fund and City Human Services. The Community Development Block Grant Funds, the city has been an entitlement jurisdiction for those monies since around 1974. We get those monies from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They've gone down drastically in the last 5 years, which you heard at our budget presentation. We are projecting for fiscal year 14 just a little bit over $656,000 from those funds. Of that, the majority are used for capital, 65% for capital, up to 20% can be used for administration of the program, and up to 15% for public services. So we have a little over $98,000 for public services. And then the city has been making human service funds available, I believe, since the 1980s when revenue sharing ended. That was also federal money that came from the federal government, and when that ended, the council decided to allocate general funds for human services funding. Those funds for fiscal year 14 are in the current budget for $628,256. And what we do with our current process, we have a combined Community Development Block Grant and Human Service application process. We combined the human services money, the $628,000, with the 15% that's allowed to be used for public services. For CDBG, they're very similar monies, the $98,000. And we do a combined application process. So people only apply for, or organizations apply for one. They fill out one application and apply for that pot of money combined. And then a similar application for the capital, CDBG capital requests, which are all bricks and mortar projects. So we currently have one advisory committee that does that process, Community Development Human Services Committee. We have one review, interview cycle, and one council action to approve those grants. So taking you back, prior to 1996, the city had two separate allocation processes, and that included two separate committees. There was a Community Development Task Force who dealt only with CDBG funds, and there was a Human Services Advisory Committee. And at one time, the Human Services Advisory Committee was under Parks and Recreation, and then they were moved over to Community Development, and a few years after they were moved, the city went to the combined process. When they were separate, they had separate council action, separate contract periods. CDBG was on a July to June contract. Human Services were October through September. So back at that time, when Human Services contracts were October through September, council was able to decide on the pot of money during the regular budget process. The downside of this was there was a duplication of staff effort. There were actually two staff, well, when it was in Parks and Rec, two very different staff efforts. The duplication of applicants. A lot of applicants applied for Community Development Public Service, and they also applied for City Human Service funds. And it was an inefficient use of volunteer committee member time. In 1996, the city decided to go to the combined allocation process. At that time, the Human Services schedule and contract periods were changed to meet the CDBG deadlines, and that's an important part of the whole timing process are the mandated deadlines we have for our community development block grant funds. Starting in 96 and until 2004, the human service funding was approved 1 year in advance. So for instance, the fiscal year 14 pot of money would have been approved in the fiscal year 12 budget. And then it would sit in the fiscal year 13 budget. And it would sit in the fiscal year 13 budget and be carried over to the next year and allocated in the next year. So at any given time, there, in the human services budget, there was the current year, which were allocated out to projects, and then a pot of money that was saved to be carried over to the next year. The benefit of the combined allocation process is that it saved time for staff, and it saved time for the nonprofits who had to apply for the funds and the volunteers that were reviewing and recommending funding. The downside of appropriating it a year in advance was that it was kind of hard accounting-wise. The carryover was confusing. When you looked at our budgets, it looked like we had double the amount of human service funding than we actually had to give away. Since 2005, we still have the same combined allocation process. However, in 2005, we changed the timing of the human service funding approvals by council. And so what happened then, and is still true till today, is council makes a commitment of the human service funds in October right before we release the applications. Council approves the distribution of the commitment of those funds in March, and then the actual amount and grants are not formally approved by council until the budget process, which is right now. So the way Mr. Peace from Finance explained it to me, there was a plan in place, and it was dealt with earlier, but it's not formally approved until the budget's approved. So the benefits of doing it this way was there's no carryover accounting issues. The allocation is made by council closer to when the human services funds are granted out, and there is a clear process for committee input as to the amount of money that they have available to recommend. The downside is it's out of sync with the overall budget discussions. And I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail on the CDBG deadlines that drive the combined allocation process. Our action plan, which is in effect our application to HUD, is due every year on May 15th. And before that date, we have to have a draft available for public review for 45 days. So the draft has to be available by April 1st. And that means that we need council approval of the individual grants and how we're going to spend the money prior to April 1st. We don't need it for the human services money, but we need it for the CDBG and the combination. So staff looked at 5 different options for this. The first one is to keep it as it is. The second option, to approve 1 year in advance, like we used to. The third, separate the two processes. 4, explore changing the CDBG grant year. And 5, keep it as it is with contingencies. And I'm going to go through all 5 of those. Keeping it as it is, council already has the ability to change the allocation during the budget process if it's needed. The potential for those changes are already reflected in the agency contracts. There's a clause in there that says that this is subject to money availability and council action. The downside of keeping, the downside of this, which has not come up, but it is a downside, is that if council decided to change it between the time March when they're approved and when the budget's adopted, there would need to be added steps. The Community Development Human Services Committee would have to go back together and make more recommendations and bring them to council for further approval. Option 2 would be to return to the previous method of approving the pot of human services funds 1 year in advance. This is a doable option. We did it for many years. The downside, at least from our standpoint, is that it would be hard to adjust if the financial outlook changed in the intervening year. Because if it was approved, say fiscal year 14 was approved in the fiscal year 13 budget, so it's sitting there as a pot of money, the committee's already, at that point, you would be appropriating the funds in March. It's a confusing topic, but you would have already approved them in March because they were already appropriated in the budget. So it would be hard to change it for the next year, I think. I might be incorrect on that one, but we'll come back to it.
Okay.
Option 3, taking us way back to how we used to do it, separate the two processes. The downside, again, increased work for staff and volunteers, transition difficulties. The first year that we did that, there'd be a 3-month void from July through September where we wouldn't have contracts with people. And we don't really recommend this, but it is an option. It would be, the difficulty in transition would be just for the human services funding if we went to the October through September contracts. Option 4, staff explored changing the CDBG grant year and moving it from July to June to October through September. I talked to our HUD representative, and she said that it is something that we can do. However, we need their approval, and she explained to me that it would be very risky financially. They don't recommend that we do this. The reason it would be really risky financially is that there's a statutory deadline that's non-negotiable. It's written in law that action plans have to be submitted by, I believe it's August 16th. It's a drop deadline. If you don't have your action plan in, you don't get money. There's no questions asked. And if we went to an October through September contract period, the 45 days before that, our action plan would have to be submitted on August 15th, which gives you 1 day for any errors or mistakes. Right now, if we're a little bit late, it's not a big deal. We just have to let them know we're going to be late. This would be a legal reason why we just would not get the money. So that's the timing there. We're not really recommending this one. And option 5, keep as it is with contingencies. Right now, the Community Development Human Services Committee prepares funding contingencies, and in the last few years, they've had to do that because we don't know what our Community Development Block Grant allocation is. We still don't know, actually. But they only do it for CDBG. They could also do it for human services funding and make that really clear to the applicants and to council. The benefit would be there would be a plan in place in case funding changed between the time that the grants were approved by council and then the budget was adopted. The downside would be that there could be some extra pressure from nonprofits during the council's budget process, because right now they're kind of concentrated in the October through March, and they come and talk to you in March. It could be that you would have more nonprofits coming during the budget process. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Could you go back to option 5 for a moment?
5, yes.
walk me through how this would work?
Okay, Chair Francisco, this, right now, council approves the applications in March, in late March. But if you'll recall, the last 3 or 4 years, because we have not really known what our CDBG allocation is, they come to you with the actual grants, individual grants, but then they also have contingencies. And they say if CDBG funding is higher than expected, then the top so many 10 or so will get a 2% increase up until their request. If it's decreased, they'll start from the bottom and go up. So they would just develop whatever contingencies they felt were needed for whatever application period it was.
Okay.
Currently, they do that just for the CDBG funds, but they could do that for human services as well. It would be something that council would ask them to do every year. Prepare, this is your amount of human services funds available, but prepare contingencies in case it changes during the budget process.
So what this would mean is we would still say is it October?
Yes.
We would still say in October, this is the amount of general fund that we're going to dedicate, but be aware that this could change when the budget is adopted next year.
Exactly,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. Other questions from the committee? Yes, Mr. White.
And so what is what's staff's recommendation?
Chair Francisco, Committee Member White, option 1 or 5, keeping it the same as it is now or adding the contingency. I think adding the contingency would make it clear to the community and to the nonprofits that apply and clear to council that you do have the option to change it, because you really do now. You have the option to change it, but I don't think that's widely known.
Right. I didn't know.
Yeah.
Not very well at all.
Okay. Any other questions? Thank you, Ms. Gray.
That's everything.
Okay.
Thank you for your patience.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yes. Mr.
So
White.
what happens with these options from here? What do we do with this? Just keep the 5 options and
This is
or do we make a recommendation today or what?
Yeah, I think it'd be, if you wanted to, you can make a recommendation that we would then forward to the council at some point.
Okay. Well, it would seem to me that adding this, what we're doing with 5 is adding a tiny bit of visible variability, which is not in the system now.
right.
And even though it's hidden in the system now, and I mean it's really hidden. If you didn't know about it, then it's
fairly hidden.
It's embedded, yeah. So I would think that adding that little bit of visibility to that variability would be a good thing. So that would be my thought.
I think the council would benefit from this presentation. So
Okay.
I would certainly entertain a motion that we recommend that this go before the council.
Well, definitely. But do we have a recommendation to council on this as well, or do you just propose that we just leave it open and have the conversation?
That's what I would propose.
Okay. Then
If I were proposing something.
I understand. Well, I'm listening and trying to respond, so I would so move.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
What are you moving?
I'm moving that this
Councilmember White?
presentation get presented to council, and that then council consider the alternatives for the human services process going forward. With obviously the 2 recommendations that staff is making is keeping things as is or adding a variability to the allocations for the human services funding as well as the CDBG funding. Did I get that right? Okay.
I'll second it, but I'd like to say that the wiggle room was not hidden from me. I knew it was there. And I am leaning toward leaving things as they are. I think nothing's broken here. But let's go ahead and send it forward to the full council. So that's a second.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Samario. Meeting adjourned.